The first gunshot shattered the morning silence at exactly 9:47 a.m., sending shards of the front window cascading across the children's reading circle like deadly confetti. Sarah Chen didn't flinch, while 12 kindergartners screamed, and their teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, frantically herded them behind the picture bookshelves. Sarah's hand moved with practiced precision to the emergency lockdown button beneath the circulation desk. Her fingers found the hidden compartment she'd installed 8 years ago, the one containing items that had no business being in a public library. "Everyone stay calm." Sarah's voice cut through the chaos with an authority that seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper than her 5'4" frame. The children stopped screaming, not because they weren't afraid, but because something in her tone promised safety with absolute certainty. Mrs. Rodriguez looked up from where she was shielding. Little Emma Martinez, her eyes wide with confusion. In 8 years of bringing her class for weekly story time, she'd never heard the soft-spoken librarian speak with such commanding presence. Sarah's mind cataloged the situation with mechanical efficiency. 3 shooters based on the firing patterns. AR-15s from the distinctive crack of the rounds. Approximately 40 civilians in the building, 17 of them children. The muscle memory she'd spent 8 years trying to bury surged through her nervous system like an electric current finding its path home. Her hands that had spent the morning helping Mrs. Patterson find large print romance novels, now moved with the fluid certainty of someone who had once been among the most lethal soldiers in the world. "Mrs. Rodriguez, take the children to the back corner behind the biography section. Keep them low and quiet." Sarah's instructions were delivered in the same gentle tone she used for reading fairy tales, but underneath lay an unshakable foundation of tactical knowledge. She knew every sightline in this building, every potential cover point, every weakness. In the architecture, what others saw as a peaceful sanctuary of learning, she had always seen as a battlefield waiting to be activated. The second volley of gunfire came from the east entrance, confirming her assessment. Multiple entry points, coordinated timing. This wasn't random violence. This was planned, professional, the kind of operation she used to prevent, back when her world was measured in mission parameters and acceptable losses rather than late fees and summer reading programs. Marcus Webb, the head librarian, emerged from his office with the shaky urgency of someone whose greatest crisis had previously been budget cuts and book censorship debates. "Sarah, we need to call." His words died as he saw her crouched behind the desk, assembling something that definitely hadn't been in the library's inventory when he'd left for his coffee break. "I've already triggered the silent alarm," Sarah said, her fingers checking the magazine of a compact pistol that had appeared from nowhere. "Police response time to this location is 11 minutes on average, 14 during morning traffic." "We don't have 11 minutes. Marcus stared at the weapon in her hands, then at her face, a face he'd worked beside for nearly a decade, a face he'd seen frown over damaged books and light up when helping elderly patrons navigate the computer catalog. Now that same face wore an expression he'd never seen before, cold, calculating, and utterly fearless. "Sarah, how did you?" "Long story," she said, checking the sightlines through the main floor. The children's section had gone quiet except for muffled whimpering. Good. Mrs. Rodriguez was keeping them calm. In the reference section, she could see Tom Bradley, the retired banker who came in every Tuesday to read newspapers, pressed flat against the floor behind the periodical racks. His face was pale, but he was following cover protocols without being told. Interesting. The main doors exploded inward with a crash that sent books flying from the nearby display. Sarah watched through the gap in the shelves as 3 figures in tactical gear swept into the building with military precision. They moved like professionals, not the wild, unpredictable movements of disturbed individuals, but the coordinated advance of trained soldiers. Someone had sent operators after a library. The question was why. "This is Alpha Team," Building secured. One of them spoke into his radio, his voice carrying the flat professionalism of military communication. Beginning sweep for package Sierra Charlie 7. Package Sierra Charlie 7. Sarah's blood went cold as understanding crashed over her like an Arctic wave. SC to 7. Sarah Chen, target number 7. They weren't here for random violence. They were here for her. After 8 years of carefully constructed normal life, her past had finally found her in the last place she'd ever expected to make a stand. The lead operator raised his weapon toward the children's section, and every maternal instinct Sarah had developed over 8 years of helping kids find the perfect book exploded into protective fury. These men had brought war into her sanctuary, threatened the children she'd watched grow from toddlers into confident readers, put Mrs. Rodriguez, who baked cookies for every library event, in mortal danger. They'd made it personal. Sarah Chen, who had spent 2,847 days learning to be gentle, who had built a life measuring success and completed summer reading challenges and literacy program graduations, who had taught herself to find joy in the quiet rustle of turning pages instead of the silence after a successful mission, felt something long dormant clicking into place behind her sternum. The woman who had once earned the call sign Phantom for her ability to appear where enemies least expected her smiled for the first time since the shooting began. It wasn't a nice smile. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice carrying a new edge that made the older man's breath catch. "Remember how you always joked that I was overprotective of this place?" "Sarah, what are you?" She was already moving, flowing from cover to cover with a grace that seemed to defy physics. The first operator never saw her coming. One moment he was advancing toward the children's section with predatory confidence. The next he was unconscious on the floor, his weapon in Sarah's hands, his radio earpiece tucked neatly into her ear. "Alpha 1 is down," crackled through the comm system. "Repeat, Alpha 1 is not responding." Sarah keyed the radio with the operator's own thumb. "Alpha 1 repositioning," she said, perfectly mimicking the clipped tone and cadence she'd heard. "Children's section clear, moving to reference." The woman who had spent 8 years perfecting her gentle librarian persona had just bought herself 60 seconds of tactical advantage. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Behind the biography shelves, Mrs. Rodriguez clutched Emma Martinez close to her chest, both of them trembling as they listened to the sound of calculated violence echoing through their safe space. The other children pressed against her like baby birds seeking shelter, their eyes wide with the kind of terror that would live in their nightmares for years to come. None of them yet understood that their soft-spoken librarian, the woman who knew all their names, who saved their favorite books, who always had band-aids and kind words ready, was about to become the most dangerous person in the building. Marcus Webb crouched behind his desk, phone trembling in his hands as he tried to process what he was witnessing. In 8 years of working together, Sarah Chen had never so much as raised her voice. She apologized to patrons for books being 2 days late. She cried over damaged first editions. She spent her lunch breaks teaching computer skills to elderly residents who couldn't afford classes. Now she was moving through his library like death itself, and he was beginning to understand that he had never known her at all. The second operator rounded the corner into the main reading area just as Sarah melted back into the shadows between the tall stacks. She had become part of the library itself, using every architectural feature she'd memorized during 8 years of quiet observation. The operator passed within 3 feet of her position, and she could have killed him in a dozen different ways. Instead, she chose the one that would leave him alive but unconscious, adding his equipment to her rapidly growing arsenal. "Alpha 2, report status," came the voice through the earpiece. "Reference section clear," Sarah responded, her vocal mimicry flawless. "Proceeding to upper level." She could hear the third operator moving through the building's east wing, where the computer lab and meeting rooms offered dozens of hiding places. He was good, his footsteps were nearly silent, his movement disciplined. But Sarah had spent years learning to track men who were very good at not being found, and this library had been her territory for 8 years. Every creaking floorboard, every squeaking door hinge, every acoustic quirk was mapped in her memory. The children were safe for now, hidden behind reinforced shelving that could stop small arms fire. Mrs. Rodriguez was keeping them quiet and calm, her teacher's instincts intact even in crisis. Marcus was following her whispered instructions to remain hidden while maintaining contact with emergency services. Tom Bradley, she'd noticed with professional appreciation, had found excellent cover and was staying put like someone who'd been in dangerous situations before. But the clock was ticking. Professional operators would have backup protocols, extraction plans, contingency measures. They'd sent 3 men for what they thought was a librarian, which meant either terrible intelligence or a significant underestimation of the target's capabilities. Sarah suspected both. The third operator appeared at the top of the stairs, his weapon sweeping the upper level with methodical precision. Sarah watched from her position behind the circulation desk, calculating angles, timing, and probabilities. She could take him from here, but the shot would alert anyone monitoring from outside. Better to wait, to let him come to her. Her phone buzzed against her hip, a text message that made her blood freeze. Package confirmed on site. Initiate burning library protocol. No survivors. No survivors. They weren't just here for her anymore. They were going to kill everyone to ensure no witnesses remained. The children, Mrs. Rodriguez, Marcus, Tom Bradley, all of them were about to become collateral damage in a war Sarah thought she'd left behind. The rage that filled her chest was different from any emotion she'd experienced during her military service. This wasn't professional anger or tactical fury. This was the protective wrath of someone who had found a family worth dying for, and who would kill anyone who threatened them. Sarah Chen, former Delta Force operator, current children's librarian, guardian of storytime and protector of late-night study sessions, checked her weapons and smiled her terrible smile. One more time. The third operator was about to learn why she'd once been considered one of the most dangerous women in the world. And why 8 years of reading bedtime stories to other people's children had only made her more deadly. 8 years, 2 months, and 16 days earlier, Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen had walked into the Riverside Public Library for the first time as a civilian. Her discharge papers, still crisp in her purse, and the weight of decisions she couldn't undo pressing against her chest like armor she couldn't remove. The job posting had been simple: part-time librarian assistant. No experience necessary. Must be patient with children and elderly patrons. She'd applied because it was the opposite of everything she'd been, everything she'd done, everything that woke her up at 3 a.m. with the taste of desert, sand in her mouth, and the phantom sound of helicopters in her ears. The interview had been conducted by Marcus Webb, whose worst day involved dealing with patrons who returned books coffee-stained or argued about late fees. He'd asked standard questions about customer service and computer skills, never suspecting that the quiet woman sitting across from him had once infiltrated terrorist cells in 3 different countries and could kill him with a pencil before. He finished asking about her availability for weekend shifts. Why do you want to work in a library? He'd asked, the kind of throwaway question that usually received throwaway answers about loving books or wanting to help the community. Sarah had looked around the peaceful space, at the children's corner with its bright cushions and picture books, at the elderly man reading newspapers by the window, at the teenage girl doing homework at a table covered with textbooks, and felt something crack open in her chest. Because it's quiet, she'd said simply. And quiet is what I need right now. Marcus had hired her on the spot, charmed by her sincerity and impressed by her references from a military transition program. He never asked about her service record, and she never volunteered details beyond logistics and security. It was A comfortable lie that allowed both of them to pretend she was exactly what she appeared to be. A veteran looking for peaceful work after completing her service obligation. The first months had been harder than any mission briefing she'd ever endured. Her body was accustomed to hypervigilance, to cataloging every person, every exit, every potential threat. The library's open floor plan and multiple entrances made her nervous until she'd spent weeks mapping sight lines and identifying defensive positions out of habit. She jumped at sudden noises, children laughing too loudly, books falling from shelves, the pneumatic hiss of the automatic doors. Her hands shook when she shelved books in the military history section, and she avoided the current events periodicals. Entirely, but slowly, incrementally, like a photograph developing in solution, Sarah began to discover who she might become in this new life. She learned the Dewey Decimal System with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to weapons maintenance. She mastered the computer catalog system and developed an intuitive sense for matching patrons with exactly the book they needed, even when they couldn't articulate what that was. Mrs. Rodriguez had been one of her first regular challenges. Kindergarten teacher who brought her class for weekly story time and always requested books that aligned with whatever unit they were studying. Sarah found herself looking forward to these sessions, preparing carefully selected books, and even learning to do character voices for the stories. The children responded to her with uncomplicated affection, treating her gentle demeanor as natural, rather than carefully constructed. "You're so good with them," Mrs. Rodriguez had commented after a particularly successful reading of The Very Hungry Caterpillar, watching Sarah help little Marcus tie his shoes while explaining the life cycle of butterflies. "Do you have children of your own?" Sarah had felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came with questions about family, about the life she'd never had a chance to build because she'd been too busy preventing other people from losing theirs. "No," she'd said simply. "But I like helping them learn." It was during her second year that she discovered her talent for connecting with the library's most challenging patrons. Tom Bradley had been a widower struggling with depression after losing his wife of 47 years. He came in every Tuesday, ostensibly to read newspapers, but really to have somewhere to go that wasn't his empty house. Other staff members found him difficult. He complained about everything from the temperature to the font size in the magazines to the young people who used their phones in the quiet section. Sarah recognized the behavior immediately. She'd seen it in soldiers dealing with survivor's guilt, with the trauma of losing teammates, with the struggle to find purpose after the mission ended. Tom wasn't difficult. He was drowning. So she began to engage him differently, asking about his wife, learning about his career as a bank manager, discovering his encyclopedic knowledge of local history. "You know, we have a volunteer position available." She'd suggested one Tuesday after he'd finished telling her about the old neighborhoods that used to exist where the shopping center now stood. Local History Archive Project. "We need someone to help organize photographs and documents from longtime residents." Tom had initially refused, grumbling about not being qualified for library work. But Sarah was patient, persistent in the same way she'd once been when gathering intelligence from reluctant sources. Within 6 months, Tom Bradley had become the library's unofficial historian, leading monthly presentations about the town's development and helping other elderly residents contribute their own memories to the growing archive. It was small victories like this that taught Sarah the difference between completing a mission and building a community. In the military, success was binary: target eliminated, objective secured, threat neutralized. In the library, success was measured in incremental changes: a struggling reader finding confidence, a lonely patron discovering connection, a community finding resources it hadn't known it needed. The nightmares had gradually lessened, replaced by dreams about story time and budget meetings, and the satisfaction of perfectly organized shelves. Sarah developed routines that anchored her to this new identity: morning coffee while reviewing the day's programming, Lunch breaks spent reading in the garden behind the building. Evening walks through neighborhoods where children played in yards and families gathered on front porches. She'd learned to love the rhythms of library life, the busy rush of after-school hours when students came to work on projects, the quiet concentration of mid-morning when retirees browsed the new fiction displays, the controlled chaos of weekend family programs. She'd become an expert in children's literature, young adult fiction, and the kind of practical nonfiction that helped people navigate divorce proceedings, job searches, and tax preparation. But the skills never fully dormant. Sarah still woke every morning at 0530, her body maintaining military precision even in civilian life. She still conducted perimeter checks when opening the building, still noted unusual behavior patterns among patrons, still kept emergency supplies hidden in locations throughout the library. These habits felt like paranoia until the day they saved lives. Marcus had once joked that she was overprotective of the building and its patrons, but he appreciated her vigilance. She'd identified and quietly resolved situations that could have escalated. The teenager who'd been using library computers to research bomb-making techniques, mental health crisis. Not terrorist planning, the patron who'd been following female staff members to their cars, restraining order obtained with Sarah's carefully documented evidence. The man who'd been using the children's section inappropriately, banned from the premises before he could harm anyone. Her colleagues saw these interventions as intuition and civic responsibility. They had no idea they were witnessing tradecraft applied to community protection. Sarah's apartment reflected her dual nature, minimally furnished but comfortable, with hidden security measures that would puzzle any maintenance worker. She'd learned to cook simple meals, to tend houseplants, to find satisfaction in domestic routines she'd never had time for during her military service. She read voraciously, making up for years of consuming only intelligence reports and tactical manuals. She discovered she had preferences in literature, that she loved mystery novels and historical fiction, that poetry could move her to tears in ways that mission debriefings never had. On weekends, she volunteered at the animal shelter, finding peace in the uncomplicated needs of abandoned pets. Dogs didn't care about her classified service record or the things she'd done in the name of national security. They only cared that she showed up consistently, that her hands were gentle, that she could be trusted. She dated occasionally careful, casual relationships with men who knew nothing about her past beyond served overseas and works at the library now. None of them lasted long. How could she explain that she jerked awake at unexpected sounds, that crowded restaurants made her nervous, that she'd never be able to share the experiences that had shaped her most fundamentally? How could she build intimacy with someone who couldn't know who she really was? But she'd found family in unexpected places. Marcus had become a surrogate father figure, worrying about her social life and inviting her to holiday dinners with his extended family. Mrs. Rodriguez included her in teachers' gatherings, treating her as an educational colleague rather than just a library employee. Tom Bradley had appointed himself her unofficial grandfather, checking on her during bad weather and insisting she join him for lunch when he suspected she was working too many hours without breaks. The children had been the greatest surprise. Sarah had expected to find them exhausting, chaotic, unpredictable. Instead, she discovered that their unguarded enthusiasm and absolute honesty were exactly what her soul needed. They didn't see a former soldier struggling with civilian life. They saw Miss Sarah, who did the best voices for story time, who always remembered their favorite books, who never seemed too busy to help them find exactly what they were looking for. Emma Martinez had been the first to break through Sarah's careful emotional barriers. A shy 5-year-old who'd been struggling to read, Emma had attached herself to Sarah during story time, always choosing to sit closest to her chair, always raising her hand to answer questions even when she wasn't sure of the answers. Sarah had begun staying after hours to work with Emma individually, using phonics games and picture books to build her confidence. The day Emma had successfully read an entire book by herself. A simple story about a cat who learned to be brave. Sarah had felt a pride deeper than any commendation she'd ever received. Emma's gap-toothed grin and excited, "I did it, Miss Sarah. I really did it," had filled something in Sarah's chest that she hadn't realized was empty. There had been other moments of unexpected grace, helping an elderly patron navigate online banking for the first time, staying late to help a high school student research, colleges when her family couldn't afford guidance counseling, organizing a community reading program that brought together senior citizens and elementary students. Each small act of service felt like penance and redemption simultaneously. Sarah Chen had learned to measure success in storytime attendance and literacy improvement statistics rather than mission completion rates. She discovered that protection could mean creating safe spaces for learning and growth rather than eliminating threats with lethal force. She'd found purpose in building community rather than breaking down enemy networks. For 8 years, she'd been successfully convincing herself that this was enough, that this was who she was now, that the woman who'd once earned the nickname Phantom for her ability to appear where enemies least expected her was gone forever, until 3 men with military-grade weapons had walked into her sanctuary and reminded her that some skills never fade, some training never disappears, and some battles choose their time and place regardless of how far you've traveled from the war. The third operator was moving down the stairs now, his footsteps barely audible but perfectly clear to Sarah's trained ears. She calculated his position, his trajectory, his probable tactical assessment of the situation. He was good, but he was operating in her territory now, among her people, threatening her family. Sarah Chen, children's librarian, keeper of story time and guardian of quiet spaces, checked her weapon one final time and prepared to remind these men why some legends never truly retire. They'd brought war to her library. Now she was going to teach them the difference between fighting soldiers and fighting a mother protecting her children. The third operator made his first mistake when he assumed the unconscious bodies of his teammates were the result of civilian panic rather than tactical precision. His second mistake was keying his radio to report the situation, giving Sarah his exact position and confirming he was working alone on the upper level. His third and final mistake was underestimating what 8 years of reading bedtime stories to other people's children had done to sharpen her protective instincts. Sarah moved through the library, stacks like a ghost returning to familiar haunts, her body remembering skills that muscle memory had preserved despite years of deliberately peaceful living. The Dewey Decimal System became a navigation grid. She was currently at 796.8, martial arts, moving towards 613.6, emergency medicine, with perfect sight lines to 364.1, criminology, where the third operator was conducting his methodical sweep. Behind the biography shelves, Mrs. Rodriguez was whispering a soft Spanish lullaby to keep the children calm. The same song Sarah had heard her use during story time when little ones got overwhelmed. The melody drifted through the library like a prayer, and Sarah felt something fierce and maternal surge through her chest. These weren't just civilians caught in crossfire. They were her people, her responsibility, her chosen family. The operator appeared at the end of the main aisle, his weapon raised in a high-ready position, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd cleared buildings in hostile territory. Sarah watched him from her concealment behind the reference desk, noting the small details that revealed his training, the way he kept his back to walls, the methodical pace that prioritized thoroughness over speed, the hand signals he used even though he believed he was alone. Military contractor, she decided. Probably former special forces, definitely experienced in urban combat operations. The kind of man who'd been hired to handle problems that regular security couldn't manage. Someone had paid significant money to send professionals after a small town. Librarian, which raised questions she couldn't afford to consider right now. Sarah's phone buzzed, again with another text. Phantom Protocol activated. Clean sweep authorized. Phantom Protocol. The code name they'd used during her final mission, the operation that had ended her military career and sent her into hiding. Someone with access to classified files was using her own psychological profile against her, betting that the mention of her old calsign would destabilize her tactical thinking. They'd miscalculated. 8 years of civilian life hadn't made her softer. It had given her something worth protecting. The operator was 20 feet away when Sarah made her move, flowing from cover with the silent grace that had once made her invisible to trained sentries. She struck with precise, non-lethal force, the kind of controlled violence she'd mastered during countless hostage rescue scenarios. The man dropped without firing the shot, his weapon secured and his communications equipment joining her growing collection. Alpha 3, status report, crackled through the earpiece. Upper level secured, Sarah responded, her vocal mimicry flawless, preparing to initiate burning library. The silence that followed told her everything she needed to know. Whoever was coordinating this operation hadn't expected their assault team to complete their objectives so quickly. They were recalculating, adapting, probably deploying backup measures she couldn't anticipate from inside the building. Sarah checked her watch. 10:12 a.m. The shooting had begun 25 minutes ago, which meant police response was imminent, despite the careful timing of the attack. But it also meant she was running out of time to neutralize whatever larger threat had prompted someone to activate a kill protocol on a library full of children. Her earpiece crackled with new instructions. Phase 2 initiated. Perimeter team, prepare for cleanup protocol. Perimeter team. There were more operatives outside, probably positioned to eliminate any survivors who tried to escape and to handle law enforcement when they arrived. This wasn't just an assassination attempt, it was a comprehensive operation designed to erase every trace of whatever connection someone thought Sarah represented. Marcus, she whispered, moving back to the circulation desk where the head librarian was hidden. I need you to do exactly what I tell you. Marcus Webb looked up at her with eyes wide behind his glasses, taking in the tactical gear she'd acquired, and the weapon in her hands with the kind of cognitive dissonance that comes from watching someone you thought you knew reveal themselves as a complete stranger. Sarah, I don't understand what's happening. Who are these men? How do you know how to? There's no time. She cut him off gently but firmly. There are more of them outside, and they're going to kill everyone in this building to get to me. I need you to gather Mrs. Rodriguez and the children and take them to the basement storage room through the staff entrance. Lock the door and don't come out until you hear my voice saying the words "story time is over." I can't leave you alone with Marcus. Sarah's voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to giving orders in life or death situations. I am the only person in this building qualified to handle this situation. The children need you to keep them safe while I deal with the threat. Can you do that for me? Marcus nodded shakily, understanding on some instinctive level that the woman he'd worked beside for 8 years had always been capable of exactly this kind of crisis response. He'd simply never seen her forced to activate skills she'd spent nearly a decade keeping dormant. Sarah watched him move toward the children's section, then turned her attention to Tom Bradley, who was still pressed against the floor behind the periodical racks. She approached his position carefully, noting that he'd positioned himself with excellent cover and clear sight lines to multiple exits. Tom, she said softly, I know you can hear me. The older man looked up, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that confirmed a suspicion she'd harbored for months. Tom Bradley's reaction to crisis, his knowledge of tactical positioning, his immediate understanding of cover protocols, none of it matched his claimed background as a small-town bank manager. Military, she asked. Vietnam. 101st Airborne. He replied quietly, 2 tours, more recent. More classified. Sarah handed him one of the weapons she'd acquired. Can you still use one of these? Tom's hands moved over the rifle with the automatic familiarity of muscle memory that never fades. Like riding a bicycle, he said grimly. What's the situation? Professional hit team, unknown number of additional assets outside, targeting. Me specifically, but willing to eliminate all witnesses. Police response probably compromised. We're on our own. Tom nodded, understanding the tactical assessment immediately. Rules of engagement? Protect the civilians. Everything else is secondary. It was a strange partnership, the former Delta Force operator and the Vietnam veteran, both of whom had spent years pretending to be harmless members of a peaceful community, now forced to acknowledge the warriors they'd never stopped being. Underneath their carefully constructed civilian identities, Sarah's earpiece crackled with updates from the operations command structure. Ground team, prepare for Phase 3. Local law enforcement, ETA 6 minutes. Window for clean extraction closing, 6 minutes. That was simultaneously too much time and not nearly enough. Too much time for the children to remain hidden in the basement. Too much time for Marcus to keep them calm while violence erupted. Above their heads. Not nearly enough time to neutralize an unknown number of professional operatives who had chosen to bring military-grade firepower into a public library. The front windows exploded inward as the perimeter team made their entry, moving with the coordinated precision of soldiers who'd rehearsed this exact scenario. Sarah counted muzzle flashes at least 4 additional operators, all armed with automatic weapons, all focused on overwhelming any resistance through superior firepower. They'd made another miscalculation. Superior firepower was only an advantage if your opponents were willing to engage in direct confrontation. Sarah Chen had spent her career mastering the art of asymmetrical warfare, using terrain and tactics to overcome numerically superior forces, and there was no terrain she knew better than this. Library. She moved through the building like water, finding its path, using every architectural feature as cover, every furniture arrangement as a defensive position. The new arrivals advanced with military discipline, but they were operating in hostile territory, now hostile not because of active resistance, but because every aspect of the environment had been unconsciously optimized over 8 years by someone who understood security better than they realized. Tom Bradley had positioned himself at the reference desk, with overlapping fields of fire covering both entrances, his Vietnam-era training adapting seamlessly to the tactical situation. Sarah watched him work and felt a stab of guilty recognition. She wasn't the only person in this building who'd been hiding their true nature. The first new operator rounded the corner into the main reading area and walked directly into Tom's kill zone. The older man's shot was precise, non-lethal, designed to incapacitate rather than eliminate. Professional restraint from someone who'd learned the difference between necessary force and excessive violence during 2 tours in Southeast Asia. Nice shooting, Sarah commented through the comm system she'd appropriated. Rusty, Tom replied. But some skills you never lose completely. The remaining operators were adapting to resistance, spreading out to avoid concentrated fire, using military tactics to clear a civilian building. But they were still thinking like soldiers conducting an urban assault rather than predators hunting in someone else's territory. Sarah appeared behind the second operator, like her old call sign suggested, materializing from shadows that shouldn't have provided adequate concealment. He went down silently, efficiently, his weapons and equipment redistributed to defensive positions throughout the library. The third operator was smarter, more cautious, using cover and concealment while advancing toward the children's section. Sarah intercepted him at the biography shelves, the irony of fighting among the life stories of peaceful people not lost on her. This one was more skilled than the others, trained in hand-to-hand combat, experienced in close-quarters battle. It didn't matter. Sarah Chen had been trained to fight people exactly like him, and she'd spent 8 years developing reasons to win that were more powerful than any tactical advantage. The fourth operator made the mistake of advancing on Tom Bradley's position, apparently underestimating the threat posed by a 72-year-old man with a slight tremor in his left hand. Tom's response was a textbook example of why some soldiers never really retire. Precise, economical, devastatingly effective. Silence fell over the library like a curtain dropping at the end of a play. Sarah listened carefully, cataloging sounds. Her own controlled breathing, Tom's steady heartbeat, the soft murmur of Mrs. Rodriguez still singing to the children in the basement, the distant wail of sirens finally approaching. "Clear," Tom called from his position. "Clear," Sarah confirmed, but her earpiece was still active, and she could hear voices coordinating something called Final Protocol, cleanup measures that would eliminate all evidence of the operation, including any surviving witnesses. Sarah looked around her sanctuary, her haven, the place where she'd learned to be human again after years of being a weapon. Books scattered across the floor, shelves overturned, windows shattered, the children's reading circle destroyed. 8 years of careful peace interrupted by 15 minutes of the violence. She'd thought she'd left behind forever. The children were safe. Mrs. Rodriguez was safe. Marcus was safe. Tom Bradley had revealed himself as an ally rather than another civilian to protect. The immediate threat was neutralized. But Sarah Chen, former Delta Force operator, current children's librarian, protector of storytime and guardian of quiet spaces, understood that this was only the beginning. Someone with significant resources and classified intelligence had decided. She represented a threat that required military-grade elimination. They'd failed today, but they wouldn't stop. And next time, they might not limit themselves to a public library during morning hours. They might target her apartment, her friends, the children who trusted her to keep them safe. Sarah checked her weapons and prepared for the next phase of a war she'd never wanted to fight but couldn't avoid any longer. The children were counting on her to end this permanently. She wasn't going to let them down. The police sirens were growing louder when Sarah heard the helicopter. Not the distinctive whoop-whoop of news media or emergency medical transport, but the deeper, more ominous thrum of military rotorcraft designed for tactical insertion. She looked through the shattered windows and saw the black aircraft settling onto the library's front lawn with precision that spoke of extensive reconnaissance and mission planning. "Tom," she called to her unexpected ally, "that's not cavalry." The Vietnam veteran followed her gaze and nodded grimly. "Cleanup crew. They're not here to rescue anybody." Sarah's earpiece crackled with new communications traffic. "Overwatch in position. Phantom Protocol now authorized for full implementation. All witnesses are expendable. All witnesses. Not just Sarah, not just the operational team, but everyone who could testify about what had happened here today." The children hiding in the basement, Mrs. Rodriguez with her gentle voice and mother's heart, Marcus with his kind eyes and dedication to community service, Tom with his hidden warrior's soul finally revealed. The helicopter disgorged 6 more operatives, these ones moving with even more precision than the assault team. Sarah recognized the tactical formation elimination specialists, the kind of soldiers deployed when an operation had escalated beyond acceptable risk parameters. They weren't here to capture or interrogate. They were here to erase Sarah. Tom's voice carried a weight of understanding earned through decades of wondering when his past would finally catch up with him. "Whatever you did over there, whatever classified operation this connects to, it's bigger than just you now." He was right, but Sarah's mind was already working 3 steps ahead, calculating possibilities, probabilities, and the one chance they had to turn this from a massacre into something resembling survival. The local police would arrive within minutes, but they'd be dealing with what appeared to be a domestic terrorist situation rather than a black operations cleanup. They'd be outgunned, outmaneuvered, and probably eliminated alongside everyone else if Sarah couldn't find a way to break the operational security that surrounded this entire scenario. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Unknown number, but the timing was too precise to be coincidental. Sarah answered, knowing she was about to hear the voice of whoever had orchestrated this elaborate assassination attempt. "Hello, Phantom." The voice was cultured, educated, carrying the kind of authority that came from operating in shadows where normal rules didn't apply. "I have to admit, your transition to civilian life has been impressive. 8 years of perfect cover identity, no contact with former colleagues, no indication of operational capability. We almost believed you genuinely retired." "Director Hawthorne," Sarah said, recognition hitting her like ice water. James Hawthorne had been her handler during her final missions, the man who'd debriefed her after operations that officially never happened. If he was personally involved in this, it meant the threat she represented went all the way to the highest levels of classified intelligence. "I'm disappointed, Sarah. We provided you with a generous severance package, a clean identity, and the chance to build a normal life. All we asked in return was your permanent silence about certain operations that could prove embarrassing to national security interests." Sarah's memory flashed back to her final mission briefing, to the documents she'd been ordered to destroy, to the evidence she'd discovered that certain operations weren't protecting American interests, but serving corporate ones. Industrial espionage, disguised as counterterrorism. Assassination missions targeting foreign officials who threatened profitable contracts. Civilian casualties categorized as acceptable losses to maintain plausible deniability. "The Meridian files," she said, understanding flooding through her like revelation. "You think I kept copies? We know you kept copies, Sarah. Our psychological profile indicated a 97% probability that someone with your moral compass would retain insurance against future retaliation. Recent intelligence suggests you've been in contact with investigative journalists, preparing to expose operations that could destabilize carefully constructed international relationships." It was a lie, but a sophisticated one. Sarah hadn't contacted any journalists, hadn't even thought about her old life beyond the nightmares that still occasionally interrupted her sleep. But someone wanted to believe she represented an active threat, wanted to justify the elimination of a highly trained operative who could potentially embarrass powerful interests. "Director, I've had no contact with. The decision has been made, Phantom. Your cover identity is hereby terminated. Collateral damage parameters have been authorized to ensure complete operational security." The line went dead, leaving Sarah with the crystal clear understanding that she and everyone in this building had just been designated as acceptable losses in someone else's political calculation. The elimination team outside wasn't just cleaning up a failed assassination. They were implementing a scorched earth policy designed to ensure that no one could ever testify about today's events. Tom Bradley had moved to the window, observing the tactical deployment with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen similar operations from the other side. "Perimeters locked down tight," he reported. "They've got the police response channeled into a kill zone. When the locals arrive, they're going to walk into an ambush." Sarah felt rage building in her chest, not the cold professional anger of her military service, but the fierce protective fury of someone watching evil threaten the innocent. These weren't enemy combatants or military targets. They were public servants responding to what they believed was a crisis at their local library. They were going to die because someone in Washington had decided that political expedience was more important than human life. "Not if I get there first," Sarah said, checking her acquired weapons and ammunition. "Tom, can you hold this position? Keep the basement secure. Where are you going?" he asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. "To remind Director Hawthorne why they called me Phantom in the first place." Sarah moved through the library with renewed purpose, Her civilian identity finally shed completely as she embraced the tactical mindset that had kept her alive through missions in 3 different combat zones. The woman who'd spent 8 years learning to read bedtime stories and help elderly patrons navigate computer catalogs was gone, replaced by the operator who'd once infiltrated a terrorist cell by convincing them she was a sympathetic journalist. She slipped out through the loading dock, using the building's service areas to avoid the perimeter team's observation fields. 8 years of working in this building had taught her every maintenance entrance, every architectural blind spot, every route that avoided the security cameras. She'd always assumed were for standard theft prevention. The elimination team had positioned themselves with military precision, but they were focused on containing the library rather than preventing exfiltration. They expected to be dealing with trapped civilians and local law enforcement, not with someone who understood their tactics better than they understood their target. Sarah appeared behind the first sniper, like her call sign suggested, materializing from concealment that shouldn't have been adequate for someone her size. The man went down silently, his radio and equipment joining her growing arsenal. She was past being concerned about non-lethal takedowns. These operatives had come here to murder children, and she was going to respond with appropriate force. The second elimination specialist was positioned on the library's roof, providing overwatch for the ground team. Sarah reached him by climbing the maintenance ladder she'd used hundreds of times to check for storm damage, moving with the silent efficiency of someone who'd spent years learning to approach targets without triggering their awareness. This one was more alert, better trained, probably ex-special forces like herself. The fight was brief, brutal, and concluded with Sarah claiming a sniper rifle that gave her significant tactical advantages over the remaining operatives. From her elevated position, she could see the entire operational deployment. 6-person elimination team, helicopter crew maintaining ready extraction, communication specialists coordinating with off-site command authority, and most importantly, approaching police units being funneled into a carefully constructed ambush. Sarah keyed the radio system she'd appropriated, broadcasting on the frequency the elimination team was using for tactical coordination. "This is Phantom. I have overwatch position and am prepared to engage all hostile assets. You have 30 seconds to abort this operation before I demonstrate why Director Hawthorne spent 8 years hoping I'd stay retired." The response was immediate. Automatic weapons fired directed at her position. Helicopter moving to provide air support. Elimination team abandoning stealth in favor of overwhelming firepower. They'd made their final miscalculation. Sarah Chen had spent 8 years learning to protect instead of destroy, to build instead of tear down, to nurture instead of eliminate. But she'd never forgotten how to be the most dangerous person on any battlefield when the people she loved were threatened. The sniper rifle spoke with authority, each shot precise, economical, devastating. The helicopter's tail rotor disintegrated in a shower of sparks and metal, sending the aircraft into an uncontrolled descent onto the empty parking lot. The elimination team found themselves pinned down by fire from someone who'd been trained to hit targets at distances they couldn't even see clearly. In the distance, Sarah could see the police units approaching the trap that had been set for them. She switched to the emergency frequency, broadcasting in the clear. "All units responding to Riverside Library. This is an active military operation. Multiple hostile assets deployed with heavy weapons. Recommend immediate tactical support and medical assistance." The police response changed immediately, patrol units taking defensive positions instead of advancing into the kill zone. Tactical teams being summoned to deal with what had clearly escalated beyond a standard domestic situation. Hawthorne's voice crackled through the radio system. "Phantom, you're only making this worse for yourself. Stand down, and we can negotiate a resolution that doesn't require additional casualties." Sarah's response was delivered in the same gentle tone she used for story time, but with an edge that carried 8 years of suppressed fury. Director, you brought military assets against a library full of children. The time for negotiation ended when you decided they were acceptable collateral damage. The surviving elimination specialists were professional enough to recognize when an operation had collapsed beyond recovery. Sarah watched them implement extraction protocols, abandoning equipment and mission objectives in favor of immediate exfiltration. The helicopter crew was transmitting mayday calls while trying to contain damage from their controlled crash. Within minutes, the library grounds were secure. The immediate threat was neutralized. The police were establishing a proper perimeter, and emergency medical teams were being allowed to approach the building. But Sarah Chen, former Delta Force operator, current children's librarian, protector of storytime and guardian of quiet spaces, understood that this was only the first engagement in a war that wouldn't end until she found a way to expose the corruption that had brought violence into her sanctuary. Director Hawthorne and his political masters had made a critical error. They'd assumed that 8 years of civilian life had made her vulnerable, had given them leverage over her through the community she'd learned to love. They were right about the leverage. They were wrong about the vulnerability. Sarah Chen had found something worth fighting for, and she was going to protect it with skills she'd spent nearly a decade trying to forget. The children were counting on her. Mrs. Rodriguez was counting on her. Marcus and Tom and everyone who'd made this library a sanctuary were counting on her. She wasn't going to let them down. 3 hours later, Sarah Chen sat in the back of an FBI mobile command unit, watching federal agents process a crime scene. That officially never happened, while Director Hawthorne's superior explained how national security sometimes required difficult decisions about acceptable risk parameters. Assistant Director Patricia Morrison was everything Sarah had expected from someone who'd risen to the highest levels of classified intelligence operations. Composed, analytical, and capable of discussing mass murder in the same tone most people used for budget meetings. She'd arrived within an hour of the engagement's conclusion, bringing with her a team of federal agents whose primary mission appeared to be containing information rather than investigating crimes. The Meridian files represent a significant threat to ongoing operations, Morrison explained, her voice carrying the patient authority of someone accustomed to explaining complex situations to people with insufficient security clearance. Your former unit conducted missions that, while necessary for national security, could be misrepresented by hostile media coverage. Sarah listened with the same polite attention she'd once given to difficult patrons who insisted the library's computer system was deliberately sabotaging their research. Morrison was delivering a carefully rehearsed justification for attempted murder, complete with patriotic language and bureaucratic euphemisms designed to make assassinating a children's librarian sound like reasonable policy. Director Hawthorne exceeded his authority, Morrison continued. The elimination protocol should never have been authorized based on speculative intelligence about potential security breaches. However, the underlying concern remains valid. Knowledge of classified operations creates ongoing vulnerabilities that must be managed. Through the command unit's windows, Sarah could see Mrs. Rodriguez being interviewed by FBI agents who were carefully not asking about the tactical capabilities demonstrated by their local librarian. The teacher's face was pale but determined, her protective instincts still activated as she insisted on staying close to the children who'd been released from the basement. After the all-clear was established, Marcus Webb was visible near the library's entrance, gesturing animatedly as he explained the morning's events to investigators, who were documenting everything while officially recording nothing. His glasses were cracked, his shirt was torn, but his eyes held a fierce pride that Sarah recognized as the expression of someone who'd discovered capabilities he'd never known he possessed. Tom Bradley had disappeared shortly after the FBI arrived, vanishing with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent decades avoiding official attention. Sarah suspected he was implementing protocols he'd developed during his own transition from military service to civilian life. ensuring that his involvement in today's events remained minimal and unremarkable. "Miss Chen," Morrison said, reclaiming Sarah's attention, "we're prepared to offer you a significant compensation package in exchange for your continued cooperation with security protocols. New identity, relocation assistance, and a comfortable civilian position that utilizes your unique skill set in ways that serve national interests." Sarah looked at the woman across from her and felt the same weary recognition she'd experienced during her final military debriefing 8 years earlier. Morrison represented a system that viewed human beings as assets to be managed, threats to be neutralized, or problems to be solved through the application of sufficient bureaucratic pressure. "I'm not interested in relocation," Sarah said simply. "This is my home. These are my people. I'm not leaving them." Morrison's expression suggested she'd anticipated this response. "Miss Chun, I hope you understand that your presence in this community now represents an ongoing security risk. Today's events have demonstrated that your civilian identity cannot be maintained indefinitely. Additional threats are likely." It was true, and Sarah knew it. Director Hawthorne's elimination attempt had failed, but the intelligence networks that had authorized it remained intact. There would be other operations, other attempts to eliminate someone who represented potential embarrassment to powerful interests. But there would also be other children who needed protection, other Mrs. Rodriguezes who deserved to feel safe in their community sanctuaries, other Marcuses who believed in the power of books and learning to make the world better. Sarah had spent 8 years discovering that protection didn't always require violence, that some battles were won by building stronger communities rather than eliminating threats. "Assistant Director Morrison," Sarah said, using her most professional library voice, "I spent 5 years eliminating threats to national security. I've spent 8 years learning to build things instead of destroying them. Today, I discovered that those two skill sets aren't mutually exclusive when the people I care about are in danger." Morrison leaned forward slightly, recognizing the shift in Sarah's tone that indicated a fundamental decision had been made. "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that you find a way to eliminate the threat I represent without eliminating me," Sarah said. "I have information about operations that could embarrass powerful people, but I also have 8 years of evidence that I'm not interested in using that information for personal gain or political advantage. Find a way to trust that, and you won't need to keep sending elimination teams to my workplace." It was a negotiation conducted in the language of mutual assured destruction, but with stakes measured in community safety rather than geopolitical advantage. Sarah was offering to remain a dormant asset in exchange for the Taza, freedom to continue protecting the people who'd become her chosen family. Morrison considered the proposal with the analytical attention of someone calculating risk ratios and probability. "Matrices, you're suggesting a modified witness protection arrangement. Continued civilian identity, but with federal oversight and periodic security reviews." "I'm suggesting that you leave me alone to be a librarian," Sarah corrected. "In exchange, I'll maintain operational security about classified information and provide consultation if community threats arise that exceed local law enforcement capabilities." Through the window, Sarah could see Emma Martinez being reunited with her parents, the little girl's tear-streaked face lighting up as she spotted Sarah through the glass. Emma broke away from her mother's embrace and pressed her face against the command unit's window, waving enthusiastically at the woman who'd kept her safe during the scariest morning of her young life. Sarah waved back, and Emma's gap-toothed grin reminded her why she'd been willing to risk everything to protect this community. These weren't acceptable losses or collateral damage. They were individual human beings whose lives had value that couldn't be measured in strategic assessments or security calculations. "There's another consideration," Morrison said, following Sarah's gaze toward the child. "Today's events have revealed that you're not the only former military asset who's integrated into this community, Mr. Bradley's service record includes classified operations that predate your own career by several decades. Sarah had suspected that Tom's involvement went deeper than Vietnam service, but the confirmation still surprised her. How many of us are there? More than you might expect, Morrison admitted. Rural communities have become unofficial retirement destinations for former special operations personnel seeking to disappear into civilian life. Usually this arrangement works well for everyone involved. Veterans get peaceful anonymity, and the government gets distributed assets who can provide informal security if regional threats emerge. It was a revelation that recontextualized Sarah's entire understanding of her adopted community. The man who'd helped her during today's crisis wasn't just a lonely widower with hidden military experience. He was part of an unofficial network of retired operators who'd chosen small-town life over continued government service. Today's operation was a significant departure from established protocols, Morrison continued. Director Hawthorne's decision to authorize lethal action against community-integrated assets has created policy complications that will require months to resolve. In the interim, you have our assurance that no additional elimination protocols will be implemented. Sarah understood what wasn't being said. Hawthorne had been operating outside official channels, pursuing personal or political objectives that hadn't been authorized by his superiors. His elimination attempt had been discovered and terminated. But the broader intelligence networks that enabled such operations remained intact. What happens to Director Hawthorne? Sarah asked. Director Hawthorne is no longer your concern, Morrison replied with the finality of someone who'd made personnel decisions that wouldn't be subject to appeal. The negotiation concluded with handshakes and paperwork that would never be filed in any official database, agreements that existed only in the memories of people whose word was their bond because written contracts would compromise operational security. Sarah would remain in her community, continue her work as a librarian, and maintain silence about classified operations in exchange for federal protection against future threats. But more importantly, she'd earned recognition as someone whose civilian identity was legitimate rather than simply convenient cover. The government would stop treating her as a retired asset waiting to be reactivated and start treating her as a citizen who'd earned the right to live peacefully among people she'd chosen to protect. 6 months later, Sarah Chen stood in the renovated children's section of the Riverside Public Library, watching Mrs. Rodriguez lead a new group of kindergartners through their first story time since the shooting. The room had been redesigned with subtle security improvements, reinforced shelving that could provide cover, emergency communication systems that connected directly to federal monitoring stations, and architectural features that created defensive positions without looking like military installations. Emma Martinez raised her hand enthusiastically when Mrs. Rodriguez asked who wanted to help read the next page, her traumatic memories already beginning to fade under the healing influence of routine and security. The other children showed similar resilience, their young minds adapting to enhanced safety measures with the flexibility that allowed them to accept metal detectors at schools and active shooter drills as normal parts of childhood. Marcus Webb had been promoted to regional library director, his crisis management skills during the incident earning recognition from state education officials who didn't know the full details of what had occurred. He'd used his new authority to implement security training for library staff throughout the state, ensuring that other communities would be better prepared for similar threats. Tom Bradley had become the library's official security consultant, his cover identity as a retired bank manager now supplemented by vaguely described Homeland Security experience that allowed him to install sophisticated protection systems without attracting unwanted attention. He still conducted his local history presentations, but now they included subtle lessons about community preparedness and mutual support during emergencies. Sarah had been offered positions with several federal agencies, opportunities to return to government service with enhanced authority and unlimited resources. She declined all of them, preferring to measure success in literacy improvement statistics and community engagement metrics rather than mission completion rates and threat elimination records. The phone on her desk rang with the distinctive tone that indicated federal communications rather than local library business. Sarah answered with practiced neutrality, knowing that her civilian life would always include periodic reminders of her former identity. "Phantom, we have a situation developing in Colorado," the voice said without preamble. "Small town, former. Assets under threat. Local law enforcement insufficient to handle the tactical requirements." Sarah looked through her office window at the children's section, where Emma Martinez was confidently reading aloud to younger students, her voice carrying the same confident authority Sarah remembered from her own storytime sessions. Mrs. Rodriguez caught Sarah's eye and smiled, an expression of gratitude and trust that reminded Sarah why she'd been willing to fight for this community. "I'm not available for field operations," Sarah replied, "but I can provide tactical consultation and recommend alternative assets who might be better positioned to assist." It was a compromise that acknowledged her continued value to national security interests while respecting her commitment to the life she'd built in Riverside. Sarah Chen would remain a librarian first and a former special operations asset second, but she'd never again pretend that those two identities were mutually exclusive. The children were counting on her to keep them safe. Mrs. Rodriguez was counting on her to maintain the peaceful environment where learning could flourish. Marcus was counting on her to protect the sanctuary they'd all worked to build. Sarah Chen, children's librarian, keeper of storytime and guardian of quiet spaces, former Delta Force operator and current community protector, hung up the phone and returned to the work that truly mattered, helping Emma Martinez choose her next book, ensuring that a bright 6-year-old's love of reading would continue to grow in safety and peace. The war was over. The real work could continue. Sarah Chen adjusted the microphone at the podium, looking out at an audience that filled the Riverside Community Center beyond capacity. The annual Library Safety and Community Preparedness Conference had grown from a local initiative to a nationally recognized program, drawing educators, librarians, and public safety officials from across the country who wanted to learn about integrated community protection strategies. In the front row, Emma Martinez sat with her 3rd grade class, now 9 years old and already reading at a 6th grade level. She'd become the library's unofficial junior ambassador, helping new children feel comfortable during story time and explaining to worried parents that libraries were safe places where grown-ups knew how to take care of everyone. Emma's confidence and articulate explanations were living proof that children could recover from trauma when surrounded by adults who prioritized their security and emotional well-being. Mrs. Rodriguez had been promoted to assistant principal at the elementary school, her crisis management skills during the library incident earning recognition that led to expanded responsibilities in emergency preparedness education. She still brought classes for story time, but now those visits included age-appropriate discussions about community helpers and the many ways adults work together to keep children safe. Marcus Webb was scheduled to speak after Sarah's presentation, his topic focusing on how libraries could serve as community resilience hubs during various types of emergencies. His expertise had been requested by FEMA and the Department of Education, leading to consulting opportunities that allowed him to influence library safety policies at the national level. Tom Bradley sat in the 3rd row, his presence both comfortable and alert in the way Sarah had learned to recognize among former military personnel who'd successfully transitioned to civilian leadership roles. He'd become the region's premier expert in unobtrusive security architecture, designing protection systems for schools, community centers, and public spaces that provided comprehensive safety without creating fortress-like environments that intimidated the people they were meant to protect. Community protection isn't just about responding to threats. Sarah began, her voice carrying the same gentle authority she'd developed for storytime presentations. It's about creating environments where people feel safe enough to build the relationships that make communities strong in the first place. The audience included faces she recognized from similar conferences across the country: librarians who'd implemented security training for their staff, teachers who'd learned to recognize potential threats before they escalated, public safety officials who developed protocols for protecting civilian gathering spaces. Sarah's reputation as a subject matter expert had spread through professional networks, though her background remained officially described as private security consulting with federal experience. In the 5 years since the Riverside incident, Sarah had been consulted on 17 similar situations where former military assets living in civilian communities had been threatened by elements of their former professional lives. None of those cases had escalated to violence, largely because Sarah's intervention protocols focused on de-escalation and protective relocation rather than tactical confrontation. She developed training programs that taught library staff to recognize signs of domestic violence, elder abuse, human trafficking, and radicalization, helping them become early warning systems for their communities without requiring them to become law enforcement officers. The programs had been adopted by library systems in 37 states, creating an informal intelligence network that helped vulnerable populations access resources while identifying threats before they became crises. The children who experienced trauma in our library 5 years ago are now some of our most confident and articulate young people, Sarah continued, gesturing toward Emma and her classmates. Not because we pretended the danger didn't happen, but because we demonstrated that adults could be trusted to protect them effectively when necessary. After her presentation, Sarah fielded questions that revealed how widely her influence had spread. A librarian from Oregon asked about implementing security protocols without frightening elderly patrons. A school administrator from Texas wanted guidance on training teachers to recognize behavioral indicators of potential violence. A federal agent, whose presence was officially unacknowledged, inquired about expanding community asset networks to include other types of former government personnel. Each question was answered with the perspective Sarah had developed over years of learning that true security came from building stronger communities rather than simply eliminating threats. The most effective protection wasn't provided by armed guards or surveillance systems, but by creating environments where people looked out for each other and intervened before problems escalated to violence. 5 years later, the Riverside Public Library's 10th anniversary celebration. Since the incident was a community-wide festival that celebrated both survival and growth, the library had become a model for other institutions, featured in academic studies about community resilience, and visited by delegations from libraries around the world. Emma Martinez, now 14 and already accepted into a prestigious early college program, served as the student keynote speaker at the anniversary ceremony. Her presentation focused on how experiencing community protection as a child had inspired her to pursue a career in international relations, specifically working with refugee communities who needed to rebuild safety and trust after experiencing violence. Miss Sarah taught me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared, Emma told the assembled crowd, her voice carrying the confident authority of someone who'd learned early that adults could be trusted to keep their promises about protection. It means you do what's right for your community, even when it's difficult. Sarah watched from the audience, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from seeing a child who'd been terrorized grow into a young woman who was determined to prevent others from experiencing similar trauma. Emma's academic success and emotional resilience were testament to the power of community healing when adults prioritize children's long-term well-being over short-term convenience. Mrs. Rodriguez had retired from teaching but continued to volunteer at the library, leading reading programs for immigrant families and helping non-English speakers access educational resources. Her programs had become so successful that they'd been replicated in library systems across the state, creating pathways for community integration that strengthened social cohesion while respecting cultural diversity. Marcus Webb had published a book about library management during crisis situations, sharing lessons learned from the Riverside incident with institutional leaders who wanted to prepare their organizations for unexpected challenges. His expertise was regularly requested by universities, government agencies, and corporate entities that recognize the value of civilian perspectives on security and emergency preparedness. Tom Bradley had quietly become one of the nation's most respected designers of protection systems for public spaces, his work extending far beyond libraries to include schools, hospitals, shopping centers, and government buildings. His designs prioritized accessibility and transparency while providing comprehensive security, proving that safety measures could enhance rather than restrict community life. Sarah had declined numerous offers to return to government service, preferring to influence policy and training through civilian channels that allowed her to maintain her commitment to community-based solutions. She'd been appointed to several federal advisory committees that developed guidelines for protecting public institutions, ensuring that her hard-won expertise informed policies that affected millions of Americans. The anniversary celebration included displays showcasing the library's expanded programming, from advanced technology training for seniors to college, preparation resources for low-income students to maker spaces where community members could develop skills in everything from 3D printing to woodworking. The building had grown from a simple repository of books into a comprehensive community resource center that provided services addressing educational, social, and economic needs. 8 years later, Sarah Chen stood in the children's section she'd once defended with lethal force, now watching her own daughter take her first tentative steps between the shelves. Little Rebecca Shen Morrison had inherited her mother's dark eyes and observant nature, though she'd grown up in a world where libraries were known as places of safety and learning rather than potential battlefields. Sarah had married David Morrison, a trauma counselor who'd been brought in to help the library staff process their experiences after the incident. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on shared understanding of how violence affected communities and mutual commitment to healing rather than simply surviving. David understood that Sarah's past included experiences she couldn't share, while Sarah appreciated his ability to help people recover from trauma without requiring them to forget or minimize their experiences. Rebecca was too young to understand her mother's history, but she was growing up surrounded by the extended family that had emerged from the library community. Emma Martinez, now a college graduate working for the United Nations, visited whenever she was in the country, always making time to read stories to the newer generation of library children. Mrs. Rodriguez had become an honorary grandmother to dozens of children whose families had found support through library programs, including little Rebecca, who called her Abuela Rosa, and received homemade cookies on every visit. Marcus Webb had retired but maintained an office in the library, where he worked on writing projects and provided mentorship to library science students who wanted to specialize in community development. His presence provided continuity for patrons who'd been coming to the library for decades, ensuring that institutional memory was preserved as the organization continued to evolve. Tom Bradley, now in his 80s but still sharp and observant, had become the library's unofficial historian and security advisor. He'd developed protocols that were used by libraries across the country, ensuring that other communities could benefit from the lessons learned in Riverside without having to experience similar trauma. The library itself had grown into a campus of interconnected buildings that served educational, social, and cultural functions for the entire region. The original building housed traditional library services and administrative offices, while newer structures included maker spaces, computer labs, meeting rooms, and even a small theater where community groups performed plays and hosted concerts. Sarah's role had evolved from children's librarian to director of community safety and educational outreach, a position that allowed her to influence policy at the state and national level while maintaining her connection to direct service. She'd helped develop training programs that were now used by library systems, schools, and community organizations throughout the country, sharing knowledge about threat recognition, crisis response, and community resilience. Her work had attracted attention from international organizations working in post-conflict communities, leading to consulting opportunities that allowed her to apply lessons learned in Riverside to much larger and more complex situations. Sarah had provided training to educators working in refugee camps, community leaders rebuilding after natural disasters, and government officials developing policies for protecting civilian populations during periods of social unrest. But her most important work remained local, ensuring that the children who came to Story Time grew up in an environment where safety and learning were seamlessly integrated, where adults could be trusted to protect them when necessary, and where community members looked out for each other as a matter of course rather than exceptional circumstance. 10 years later, the dedication ceremony for the Sarah Chen Community Safety Institute took place on a sunny October morning, exactly 10 years after the incident that had transformed a small-town library into a national model for community resilience. The institute occupied a new building adjacent to the library, designed to train educators, public safety officials, and community leaders in integrated approaches to protection and service. Emma Martinez, now Dr. Emma Martinez, and Director of Refugee Services for an international humanitarian organization, delivered the keynote address to an audience that included federal officials, academic researchers, and community leaders from around the world. Her work with displaced populations had earned international recognition, and she credited her early experiences at the Riverside Library with inspiring her commitment to creating safe spaces for vulnerable people. The lesson I learned here as a 6-year-old is the same lesson I try to teach in refugee camps and disaster zones around the world, Emma told the assembled crowd. Safety isn't just about protecting people from immediate threats. It's about creating environments where people can build the relationships and develop the skills they need to protect themselves and each other. Sarah watched from the audience, holding 18-month-old Rebecca while maintaining the kind of environmental awareness that would never completely fade from her consciousness. Even in this celebration of community achievement, she remained alert to potential threats, her eyes automatically tracking the positions of security personnel and noting the locations of emergency exits, but her vigilance was relaxed rather than tense, the alertness of someone who'd learned to distinguish between reasonable precaution and paranoid hypervigilance. The community she'd helped build was genuinely safer than most places, not because of enhanced security measures, but because of the networks of mutual support and early intervention that prevented most problems from escalating to violence. The Institute would train thousands of people over the coming years, spreading lessons learned in Riverside to communities across the country and around the world. Sarah's influence would extend far beyond her physical presence, carried forward by students who understood that true security came from building stronger communities rather than simply responding to threats after they emerged. Mrs. Rodriguez, now in her 70s but still energetic and engaged, had been named the Institute's first director of community engagement, ensuring that training programs remained connected to the practical realities of serving diverse populations with varying needs and resources. Her expertise in working with children and families would inform curriculum development for years to come. Marcus Webb had donated his extensive collection of research materials to the Institute's library, creating a resource that scholars and practitioners could use to study community resilience and emergency preparedness. His book had become required reading in library science programs, and his consulting work had influenced policy at the federal level. Tom Bradley had established an endowment, fund that would provide scholarships for veterans transitioning to civilian careers in education and community service. Recognizing that former military personnel often possessed skills that could benefit civilian populations when applied through appropriate channels, the ceremony concluded with a reading from the children's section of the original library, where a new generation of kindergartners listened to stories about brave animals and kind people who helped each other during difficult times. Rebecca Chun Morrison sat among them, too young to participate, but old enough to absorb the rhythms of community storytelling that had shaped her mother's approach to protection and service. 15 years later, Dr. Sarah Chen stood before the United Nations Security Council, presenting findings from the Global Community Safety Initiative that had grown from her work in Riverside into an international network of communities implementing integrated protection and development programs. The woman who had once been known by the calcine phantom now addressed world leaders about the power of local solutions to global security challenges. Traditional security models focus on responding to threats after they emerge, Sarah explained to the assembled diplomats and military officials. Community safety models focus on creating conditions where threats are less likely to develop in the first place. The difference isn't just tactical, it's philosophical. Her presentation included case studies from dozens of communities around the world where her training programs had been implemented, showing measurable improvements in educational outcomes, economic development, and social cohesion alongside reductions in crime and violence. The Riverside model had been adapted for use in post-conflict zones, refugee settlements, urban neighborhoods struggling with poverty and violence, and rural communities dealing with economic disruption. Emma Martinez, now Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, introduced Sarah's presentation with personal testimony about how community-based protection had shaped her own development from traumatized child to international leader. The United Nations had recognized the Riverside approach as a best practice for protecting civilian populations, recommending its adoption by member nations facing internal security challenges. Mrs. Rodriguez, despite being in her 80s still, traveled internationally as a consultant on child protection and educational resilience. Her expertise in maintaining learning environments during crisis situations recognized by UNESCO and other international organizations, her gentle voice and maternal presence had helped develop protocols for protecting schools and educational programs in conflict zones around the world. Marcus Webb's research on institutional resilience had influenced policy at the highest levels of government, with his recommendations incorporated into federal guidelines for protecting public institutions during emergencies. His work had expanded beyond libraries to include hospitals, schools, government buildings, and other facilities that served vulnerable populations. Tom Bradley had passed away 2 years earlier, but not before seeing his security design principles adopted by architects and planners working on public buildings around the world. The Tom Bradley Center for Protective Architecture at the Institute ensured that his legacy would continue influencing the design of spaces where safety and accessibility were equally prioritized. Rebecca Chen Morrison, now 15 and already accepted into advanced placement programs that would allow her to graduate high school early, had grown up understanding that her mother's work involved helping people stay safe during difficult times. She'd inherited Sarah's observational skills and protective instincts, but she'd also developed David's empathy and communication abilities, creating a combination that suggested she might follow her mother into community safety work. Rebecca had never needed to see Sarah's tactical skills deployed in actual combat, but she'd observed her mother's ability to diffuse tense situations, de-escalate conflicts, and create safe spaces for vulnerable people. The teenager understood that true strength often involved preventing violence rather than winning fights, and that the most effective protection came from building communities where people looked out for each other. The Riverside Public Library had become a pilgrimage site for librarians, educators, and community leaders who wanted to study successful models of institutional resilience. Visitors came from around the world to observe programs that had proven effective at integrating safety and service, learning lessons they could adapt to their own communities' specific needs and circumstances. The children's section where Sarah had once made her stand was now marked with a small plaque that read, "In this space, ordinary people discovered extraordinary courage." Their example reminds us that communities are strongest when every member is committed to protecting others. The plaque didn't mention tactical operations or eliminated threats. Instead, it celebrated the community bonds that had motivated people to risk everything for each other. 20 years later, Sarah Chen stood in her garden behind the house she'd built on land adjacent to the library campus, watching her daughter Rebecca practice tactical drills with other teenagers who'd enrolled in the Institute's youth leadership program. At 35, Sarah's hair was beginning to show gray at the temples, and her movements carried the careful precision of someone who'd learned to manage the long-term effects of a physically demanding career. Rebecca, now 20 and a junior at Harvard studying international relations and conflict resolution, had chosen to spend her summer working at the Institute rather than pursuing internships with government agencies or international organizations. She'd inherited her mother's protective instincts and analytical abilities, but she'd grown up in a world where those traits were channeled toward building peace rather than winning wars. "Mom," Rebecca called, jogging over after completing a scenario-based exercise in crisis communication. Dr. Martinez sent a message from Geneva. "The Syrian Refugee Integration Program wants to implement our community safety model in 3 more camps." Emma Martinez, now in her 40s and one of the most respected humanitarian officials in the world, maintained close contact with the Riverside community despite her international responsibilities. Her work continued to demonstrate that children who experienced effective protection and community support could recover from even severe trauma and grow into leaders who prevented others from suffering similar experiences. The integration program Rebecca mentioned was one of dozens of international initiatives that had grown from lessons learned in Riverside. Sarah's approach to community safety had been adapted for use in refugee camps, post-conflict reconstruction zones, disaster recovery areas, and urban neighborhoods struggling with violence and economic disruption. Sarah's phone rang with the distinctive tone that indicated federal communications, though these calls now involved consultation rather than operational deployment. At 55, she'd established herself as one of the world's leading experts on community-based security, her influence extending through academic research, policy development, and training programs that had reached millions of people. "Mrs. Morrison," the voice said, using the civilian name that had replaced her former callsign in all official communications. "We have a situation developing in the Pacific Northwest. Multiple communities with former assets under threat, local resources insufficient, requesting consultation on protective relocation versus community fortification options." Sarah listened to the briefing while watching Rebecca demonstrate de-escalation techniques to younger students, seeing her daughter naturally apply lessons about building trust and maintaining calm during stressful situations. The next generation was learning to prevent crises rather than simply respond to them, developing skills that could create peace rather than just win conflicts. "I can provide strategic consultation," Sarah replied, "but field implementation should be handled by local assets with community integration. Send me the threat assessment, and I'll recommend protective protocols that preserve community bonds while ensuring adequate security." It was the same answer she'd given to hundreds of similar requests over the past decade. Sarah Chen Morrison would remain available for consultation and training, but her operational days were over. Her most important work now involved ensuring that others could apply her hard-won expertise without having to learn its lessons. Through similar trauma, The conversation concluded with scheduling details for virtual briefings and training sessions. That would help other communities implement protective measures without disrupting the social bonds that made them worth protecting. Sarah's influence would continue expanding, carried forward by students who understood that true security came from building stronger communities rather than simply eliminating threats. As evening approached, Sarah and Rebecca walked together through the library campus, past buildings that housed programs serving thousands of people each year, past gardens where community members gathered for outdoor programming, past the memorial wall that honored those who'd given their lives protecting others. "Do you ever miss it?" Rebecca asked, referring to the military career her mother rarely discussed in detail. "The missions, the travel, the sense of serving something bigger than yourself?" Sarah considered the question while looking around at the community she'd helped build, at the lights in library windows where evening classes were preparing adult learners for better jobs, at the institute building where tomorrow's community leaders were learning to prevent violence rather than simply respond to it. "Every day I serve something bigger than myself," Sarah replied. "But now it's something I helped build rather than something that was built around me. The difference is that I get to see the results of my work in your face, in Emma's accomplishments, in every child who grows up feeling safe enough to dream about changing the world." They paused in front of the children's section, where maintenance staff were preparing for the next day's story time. Through the windows, they could see the reading circle where Mrs. Rodriguez had protected kindergartners during the worst morning of their young lives, where Sarah had made decisions that saved their community from becoming a tragedy that people remembered rather than a triumph they celebrated. "The children from that first story time are adults now," Sarah continued. "They're teachers and doctors, and engineers and social workers. They're parents who know how to create safe spaces for their own children. They're community leaders who understand that protection is about building up rather than tearing down." Rebecca nodded, understanding that her mother's legacy wasn't measured in missions completed or threats eliminated, but in generations of people who'd learned to protect each other through care rather than violence, through community building rather than individual heroism. As they walked home together, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from the isolation of classified operations to the abundance of community life. She'd learned that the most important battles weren't fought against external enemies, but for the creation of spaces where people could flourish without fear, where children could grow into adults who chose cooperation over conflict, where communities could resolve problems through mutual support rather than mutual destruction. The woman who had once been known as Phantom for her ability to appear where enemies least expected her had become Miss Sarah to hundreds of children, who expected her to be present whenever they needed protection, education, or simply someone who would listen to their stories and help them find the books that would expand their understanding of what was possible. Sarah Chen Morrison, former Delta Force operator, current community safety expert, lifetime guardian of storytime and protector of quiet spaces, had found the mission that would define the rest of her life, ensuring that other communities could build the safety and resilience that allowed people to choose love over fear, cooperation over competition, and hope over despair. The war was over. The real work would continue for generations. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the library before dawn, as had been her habit for 20 years. She unlocked the doors, turned on the lights, and began the routine that prepared the building for another day of serving community needs. The emergency protocols were still in place, the security systems still active, the defensive positions still carefully maintained, but they were background elements now, invisible infrastructure that allowed the real work to proceed without interruption. The story times that built literacy and imagination, the computer classes that created economic opportunities, the meeting spaces that fostered civic engagement, the quiet corners where people could find the information and resources they needed to solve their problems and pursue their dreams. At exactly 9 a.m., Sarah opened the front doors to welcome the first patrons of the day. Mrs. Patterson, now in her 90s but still an avid reader, was waiting with her characteristic patience for access to the large print romance novels that had become her specialty. Behind her, a young mother with twin toddlers balanced diaper bags and picture books, preparing for what would probably be a chaotic but educational visit to the children's section. Tom Bradley's successor as volunteer historian, a retired teacher named Janet Williams, arrived with a box of photographs donated by a local family whose patriarch had recently passed away. The archive project had grown into a comprehensive collection that documented the community's development over more than a century, preserving stories that would otherwise be lost as older residents passed away. By 9:30, the building was humming with the quiet activity that characterized a well-functioning library, keyboards clicking as patrons researched jobs and college programs, pages turning as children discovered new stories, conversations murmuring as staff helped people find exactly what they needed. Sarah Chen Morrison, children's librarian, director of community safety, former special operations soldier, current guardian of peaceful spaces, stood behind the circulation desk and smiled at the sight of her chosen family pursuing their daily routines in perfect safety. She'd kept her promise. The children were safe. The community was strong. The stories would continue, and somewhere in the stacks, between the poetry section and the biography shelves, the spirit of every person who'd ever chosen to protect others rather than themselves smiled back. Subscribe to my channel, where silence is never forgotten. For 8 years, she worked as a librarian until they needed her Delta Force training.